Good morning, and thank you for being here today, everyone. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. And joining me today again is Don Moynihan. He is a professor at the University of Michigan at the Ford School of Government, and he's also the co-director of the Better Government Lab. He writes the Can We Still Govern Substack, which you should definitely subscribe to. And you have probably read a lot of his articles on Lincoln Square, going through the ins and outs of the Trump administration and the many changes for better and really mostly worse that we've been experiencing. So thank you again for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here. There's a lot to talk about.
There is. And I thought that we could start with all of this turmoil that's going on at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, as well, which is under RFK Jr.'s Health and Human Services Department. So yesterday, we got news that CDC Director Susan Monarez, who, is just about a month into the position, she, according to RFK Jr., he's fired her. She has responded and said that she will not resign. But the backstory of this seems to be that she refused to revoke the approvals for the COVID vaccines. And of course, it's fall, just about fall. It's the fall semester, at universities, and this is the time that we traditionally see the new boosters being approved, as we're heading into those winter months when, of course, flu and COVID cases spike. We know that RFK Jr. has been a long-standing, eh, eh, you know, um, foe of vaccines long before even COVID. He's made no secret of the fact that he wants to have the department be a bulwark against vaccine research, as we've seen with many moves. But now it seems that we are really hitting a new crisis point because we did see an approval of new vaccines, but it's extremely limited for folks who are under 65. You have to meet certain criteria, I believe possibly get approval from a doctor, and there are questions if your insurance will cover it, which is a huge change from Operation Warp Speed, which was under Trump during his first administration, where, this program took off during the early days of COVID to get us to the point where we had vaccines, and the vaccines were free for everyone. That the research on this is indisputable. I mean, it has saved millions of lives, as Trump's former Surgeon General, came out and said. So, there's just so much to cover here. But basically, I guess what I'm curious about, Don, is talk to us about what this latest crisis at the CDC tells us about the Trump administration's approach to governing and science.
Well, it's a fascinating story because there's so much baked into it. And so one of the things you mentioned about the vaccines, when RFK went before the Senate, he said anyone who wanted a vaccine will be able to get one. That was his pledge. It doesn't appear that that is going to be true going forward. And
Right.
what we're hearing is that he wants to fire Monarez. So Susan Monarez, who's the director of the CDC, because of two things. One is she is not going along with his new vaccine policies. She's not supporting those policies publicly. And two, she reached out to a couple of senators, including Bill Cassidy, who was a crucial vote in getting RFK over the line and into his position as HHS.
And
One thing
and
that
got, Cassidy is a doctor, who's been very pro-vaccine.
Cassidy is someone who has been more vocal about the risks to public health from RFK Jr. He, very publicly debated with himself about whether he would support RFK Jr. or not, and eventually was provided the crucial vote to get him over the line. And I think it's important to understand about the CDC is that traditionally this is a political appointment position that they serve at the pleasure of the president. But there are a couple of wrinkles to that. One is that they have almost, I believe, Monarez will be the first non-doctor to have been director of CDC. So it's a position that presidents have historically said we want to put a doctor in place. So she's not a medical doctor, but she is an infectious disease researcher. So someone we should think of as a person who knows a lot about the evidence on this topic. Um, and then the chronology of this has just
Mm.
been extraordinary. So here's what happened. HHS tweets out saying that she's no longer director.
Which gets reported all over the news media.
Spreads across and but the language is ambiguous. Just says she's no longer director, doesn't say if she resigned or if she was fired. Then we find out that several other senior CDC leaders, sort of key leaders of programs, have also resigned. So they wrote very public resignation letters. They posted them immediately on the media, or they emailed them to members of the CDC, and they leaked. So it's not just Monarez. You have then like several leaders of this critical function who say, and they're very explicit, the weaponization of information against government, against vaccines is threatening public health. It is encouraging violence. I mean, remember someone was killed at the CDC in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago when a gunman who had anti-vaccine views assaulted the building and killed a police officer. And
Yeah.
so they're very squarely blaming RFK Jr. for this. And then the most fascinating thing is that it's not clear if Monarez is still in office or not. And this is, now we get into the technical details. Her lawyer came out and said she has not resigned and
Mhm.
she has not been fired. And technically, as a Senate confirmed political appointee, the only person who can fire her is President Trump. It's
Mhm.
not RFK Jr. And it sort of seems like they threatened her. They said, you have to resign or we'll fire you. And
Mhm.
she said no. And they did not get that letter from Trump to push her out.
Yeah.
And as of last night, they were still saying, well, the White House says you're out, but her lawyer is saying we have gotten no letter firing us. And so it sounds like a clown show in terms of just the administrative management of the situation.
And, the interesting thing is that, President Trump has been able to kind of distance himself from some of the craziness that's been going on at Health and Human Services. Whenever he is asked about um, any details like, having hundreds of millions of dollars in vaccine research, being canceled. They were working on potentially a cancer vaccine, and that mRNA research has been canceled as part of RFK Jr.'s assault on vaccines and research. But Trump is able to tap dance and say, "Oh yeah, I want to make America healthy again. I'm all on board, and that all sounds good." But he leaves the nagging little details to RFK Jr., who has clearly been empowered to make these sweeping decisions. And somehow, it never seems to come back to Trump. Trump will make comments like, oh, yeah, I did warp speed. That was great. But like not taking responsibility for vaccine research being dismantled from the inside in the government, even though he's the guy in charge. With this crisis now, it really seems like he won't be able to avoid, being the ultimate authority, because if they want Monarez out, he is going to have to be the one to say, yes, let's get rid of her. And then it falls on him. And he's already weakened because, the economy is not doing as well as he, claimed it would. And we'll get into all of the crisis with the Bureau of Labor Statistics that you've been detailing. Um, he is facing backlash over not releasing the Epstein files. And so he's not in the strongest political position for, this huge crisis at the CDC at a time when, in a few months, when people are starting to get sick with COVID again, this will be on people's minds.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that Monarez and her lawyer is doing here that is really smart is that they're forcing Trump to come to the table and add his signature to a firing letter to take some responsibility in this mess so that down the road, when people start to die, or God forbid, we get another pandemic and we're asking why don't we have the vaccines in place, then there will be a moment when the public can look back and say, well, you fired the competent infectious disease person who was making decisions based on evidence, and instead you went with the anti-vax crank who basically wiped out the scientific research programs that were trying to keep us safe here.
Right. It would seem that this would be the time for someone like Bill Cassidy, senator from Louisiana, to speak out. He's been a big advocate for public health. He, as you mentioned, he expressed doubts about RFK Jr.'s leadership before he ultimately voted for him. And, Monarez reached out to him specifically. This would seem to be a time for him to choose between, loyalty to his party or to, the president's choice for HHS. And really, if he does believe, what he has said and devoted his career to, public health.
Yeah, and I think um, RFK is not a core part of the MAGA movement, right? He is a latecomer who could have just as easily have joined a Harris cabinet. He was reviewed for an Obama EPA job. So he's not really deeply tied to the coalition, and Trump could cut him loose in the same way he cut Elon Musk loose when he became too much of a political liability. I mean, I guess if I was Cassidy right now, or if I was other members of the oversight committees, I would be calling hearings and I would be calling Monarez and I would be calling RFK and the people who resigned and ask them to explain to the public what is going on in a transparent fashion. Because the other thing is, it seems like ridiculous reason to fire a Senate confirmed appointee because they were talking to the Senate. Like, if
Right.
that's the standard now, then that means no one can talk to the Senate. If you veer any way from the party line, you will be fired, and that also weakens the position of the Senate. And so there is an institutional interest on the part of the senators, even people who support President Trump, to say, "Look, this is a complete mess. Obviously, things are not going well. If people need to go, maybe they're not the people who are really invested in public health." And
Right.
let's see if that happens in the next week or two. But Congress is going to come back from recess pretty shortly. This should be at the top of their agenda.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. RFK Jr. has been an opportunist. He was clearly just trying to angle for some sort of, position and was boosted by all of the conspiracy theories during the pandemic. And so, there definitely was an in for him with the MAGA movement because, so many of them were anti-vaccine. But, the anti-vaccine movement, has not necessarily just lived on one side of the political spectrum or the other. There, definitely have been some folks on the left, as part of this kind of wellness movement that, RFK Jr. is a part of that, has been anti-vaccine and this idea of living naturally and you don't need vaccines, although somehow I suppose, taking steroids or, plastic surgery are part of the wellness movement too, which personally I've never understood, but that's not my area of expertise. But I would think that, if this does become toxic, that, RFK Jr. could find himself on the outs with Trump. He's very good at trying to get rid of any political liabilities, that he Trump is a survivor, and that's one of his strengths is that, he demands loyalty, but he has loyalty to no one. And that's kind of been, how this second Trump administration has functioned. It seems like um, there have been a lot more loyalists who have been installed, like Kash Patel at the FBI, Pam Bondi at the Department of Justice, people who were not certainly you would consider to be the most qualified for their positions, but they've pledged their loyalty to Trump and they're there to serve him and his agenda, and that's what he demands. What are the implications, though, in terms of our country when you are prizing loyalty over people who really know what they're doing?
Yeah, I think we have sort of an actual research basis for this, mostly looking at other countries, which is that when you build a personalist governmental system, that is to say, where a political movement is built around loyalty to one person, then that tends to, in the long run, be bad for everyone else. Um, and there are a bunch of reasons why that occurs. One is that um, loyalists value basically being subservient over really investing in expertise. And the political leader, in this case Trump, values loyalty over merit. And so you tend to end up hiring second-rate people whose main qualification is they know what to say to please their master, but they will never provide hard truths. And this is something we are seeing across government now, and maybe this is a good time to start talking about the BLS, but we see it in intelligence agencies. I think yesterday we saw that a Russia expert from the CIA had her security clearance revoked
Mm,
just days after the conference between Putin and Russia by
yeah,
Tulsi Gabbard. We've seen senior analysts being removed because they didn't provide rosy enough assessments of Trump's bombing of Iran. Um, and ultimately, if you are a government where you fire all of the people who know what they're doing or are willing to tell you the truth when things go wrong, then what you're left with is a group of yes men,
right.
and you're stuck in a bubble. You're not going to be able to make decisions based on a full review of information, and so you make worse decisions, and you're not broadly concerned about the impact of those decisions on the public. And I think that is very much the pattern across agencies now, where we see this happening again and again.
Yeah. So with the situation BLS, this kind of started to spiral at the beginning of the month when there were some revised job reports that came back and showed that the economy was a lot weaker than we initially thought. And of course, that was one of Trump's fundamental, campaign pledges that he would fix inflation and make the economy stronger. His primary economic policy has been instituting tariffs and now with his budget bill, cutting taxes for the very wealthy. But inflation is ticking up. Jobs are, soft, and Trump doesn't like these numbers. And so his solution was to fire the person who came up with the report, which definitely sounds like an autocratic move. You don't like the numbers, so you get rid of the experts who gave you the bad numbers, and he found someone that he thinks can give him better numbers. The former chief economist of the right wing Heritage Foundation, EJ Antoni, who you have written about, and clearly doesn't have the traditional qualifications of someone in this position. But he didn't stop with that. He also, is claiming to fire Lisa Cook, who is a former professor at Michigan State University, also a commissioner on the BLS, although she is disputing that. And the courts have said that he does not have this authority. So once again, you've got this crisis in governance, but fundamentally, it seems to be the same pattern. He um, does not like what experts are telling him, and so he wants to replace them with people who will. But you're creating a crisis. At HHS, you have a crisis in public health. Here at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I mean, what happens if nobody can believe the economic numbers that are coming out of the US government? I mean, this has huge implications for the world economy, right?
Absolutely. And this is again, you're correct. This is a pattern, and it's sometimes overwhelming when you read an individual story in the news and you say, "I don't know what BLS is. Like I've never heard that acronym before." So how do I make sense of this? But the pattern is consistent, even if you don't know the acronym of the agency, which is that people who know what they're doing are being replaced by loyalists. In the case of the BLS, it has one really important job, which is to provide data on economic activity. It has some broadly accepted means of doing that. It's sort of hard to mess with those means. Um, but Trump was not happy with those job numbers, as you described. And in a way, it was pretty important, partly because what Trump has been defying all sorts of basic economic rules, right? Like, so we're going to add tariffs, which any Econ 101 textbook would say is going to increase inflation. It's going to make it costlier, as well as reduce economic activity. And up to now, up to relatively recently, we hadn't seen that show up in the numbers. The stock market continues to boom. Job
Right.
market reports were pretty good. And so it felt a little bit like, oh, the numbers are catching up with economic reality here. And I think that's
Mhm.
part of why Trump is just so angry about this. But there's also a huge level of hypocrisy here where last year when numbers were revised under Biden,
Mhm.
Trump had no problem with that. He was using the argument right before the election to say, look, Biden's numbers are not as good as he told us earlier in the year because the BLS has revised those numbers. So the
Mhm.
BLS did exactly the same thing that they did under Biden as they did under Trump. But for Trump, he took this as a personal affront, got rid of the leader who again is a political appointee. He has the legal right to replace that person. But historically, that person has tended to be someone who was an expert in statistical data collection and an economist. Um, he replaced that person with EJ Antoni, who I think is an economist. He has a PhD in economics. Certainly not a prominent one. I don't. I think he may have one peer-reviewed publication. Is not cited or broadly considered in the economics profession as someone who is an important figure. But he was there at the January 6th uprising. He says he was
Right.
just a bystander. He was just happened to be walking through the front of the Capitol as it was happening. People can
Mhm.
decide if they want to believe that or not. And he is aligned with the Heritage Foundation, which produced Project 2025.
Right.
Very active on social media, very supportive of the president's agenda. Um, very critical of the experts in BLS. And so he had all of the qualifications that Trump is looking for. He's a Trump loyalist. He will attack the experts. And he isn't really that bound by professionalism as a criteria. Like he's
Mhm.
flexible when it comes to that. And he's talked about changing the way data is collected. And so what this does is it puts us in a situation now where businesses and the rest of the world have to wonder if they can still trust the economic data coming from America. And we've seen what happens in countries like Argentina, in
Or
Turkey,
Greece.
or Greece, where they have fired statisticians and the equivalent of the BLS for not producing good enough numbers. Basically the market stopped taking those numbers seriously.
Right.
It reduced the credibility of the government. Economic activity goes down. So there is a real penalty to pay here. It's not just a dispute among folks in Washington. It is going to affect the economy of the United States.
And I mean, as serious as it is for other countries like Argentina or Greece to fudge with the numbers, I mean, none of them are the economic powerhouses that America is. And so, so much of the world economy is dependent on um, having the US have, a strong economy and being able to trust the Federal Reserve and numbers here. And so, I mean, this is a situation that seems somewhat unprecedented to me.
Yeah, and I think one of the things America has going for it is as a democracy that is based on, you know, basically transparency and competence, we look pretty good compared to other great powers over the last 50 years. So historically, Russia,
Mhm.
or today China, where
Mm.
they're great powers, but you can't really trust the data that they produce, like the claims that Russia was making about COVID, or China was
Right.
making about COVID. People didn't really believe that data in the same way I think people are generally suspicious of a lot of the claims of the Chinese government. And so that was an inherent advantage investors saw in America compared to these more authoritarian regimes. As we give up that advantage, then we're leveling the playing field and making places like China look more attractive to investors, where they're saying,
Right.
look, if we can't trust the numbers in either place, why not go with China? And it's sort of a double penalty for the US, where right now we're also punishing other countries. The tariffs in India just kicked in yesterday,
Right.
50% tariff. India has had this long running fight with China, but now Modi is flying to China next week because he needs to find other customers for Indian goods. And
Right.
so, in some ways, we're pushing these countries into the arms of our rivals like China, partly because we're making dumb economic choices,
Mhm.
and then we're not telling the truth about those choices.
Right. And so, if if we're not able ultimately to trust data from this administration, whether it's economic data or data that's coming out of FEMA for natural disasters or health and human services data, you know, where does that leave us? In terms of just anyone who's like facing a hurricane coming their way, for public health, for the economy, because y- you know, this isn't just something at, the macro level. This impacts people in terms of their lives and their decisions. And, this is kind of like the hidden part of government that
Mhm.
you don't think of because, you don't have to. But once it's gone, that has massive implications.
Yeah, I think from the everyday perspective of living your life, the Trump administration is just shifting a lot more risk onto
Mm.
you and your family, right? So, and this cuts across the board, right? If you're in the pathway of a hurricane, the people who work at FEMA have gone public and said, you are more vulnerable because of the mismanagement of FEMA. They wrote an open letter saying this, and a bunch of them got put on administrative leave as a result of that, like just trying to tell the truth of what's happening inside the agency. If you are facing some sort of financial scam, the Consumer Protection Financial Board no longer exists because the Trump administration did away with it. And so there's example after example where you as an individual in the past might have been able to rely on some sort of help from government, in your daily life. Maybe it was imperfect, maybe it was slow, maybe it was bureaucratic, but it existed. And now that resource is just not going to be there, or it's going to be
Mhm.
there in a much less competent fashion, and you're effectively being left on your own. And I think, this is partly a philosophical thing that Trump
Right.
administration doesn't believe that government should be helping people in these ways and doesn't believe that these agencies like FEMA or the CFPB or the Department of Education should exist. And so they're going to get rid of them.
And it seems like, part of the strategy for the Trump administration is, basically relying on propaganda. People like E.J. Antoni who will tell you that everything is great with the economy. And, Kristi Noem will tell you that FEMA is working great. But, at some point, you can't fool all the people all the time. I mean, if you're losing your job and everyone in your town is, if you've lost your house in a tornado or a hurricane, if people are getting, sick due to diseases that, they weren't before, I mean, people know that something is wrong. So what's the end game? Is this basically the Trump administration trying to consolidate power before people realize how much they've lost?
I think so. I genuinely think so. I wrote something today about what I call the authoritarian checklist, which is like where are the centers of power and dissent in society? And it's places like the legal system, the military, internal security, education. And you can see in all of those different spaces, Trump has made tremendous efforts to take control. Um, and this includes tremendous efforts to control the media, where he's basically removed funding from public media that he sees as contrary to his views. He has sued private media, and I think has been pretty successful in getting a lot of that private media on board and to be less confrontational. And he has his own media. There's something like 24 members of Fox News are part of the administration. There's no real separation between the administration and a good chunk of the media that covers him. And so
Absolutely.
when do people realize this? I think partly they have to look outside for his supporters, their traditional media sources, because they're just going to hear the same old thing for the next couple of years about how tremendous the president is doing, how all of the problems are driven by Democrats, how illegal immigrants or safety are the main issues rather than whether you've lost your job or you can't get a vaccine. Um, and I think it is going to be hard. One thing we know from research about what political scientists call motivated reasoning is that once we invest in an idea and a political movement, it's very hard to walk away from that. It
Mhm.
requires a really strong break because there's a lot of cognitive dissonance to admit you were
Right.
wrong, to admit your worldview was based on false beliefs. That is incredibly difficult for people to do, but it may take those sort of things like personal tragedies or realization that things are not going the way they thought to come to that. The one optimistic note, and I know it's very depressing, but the one optimistic note is that like the thing we have known since about 2017 is that there is like one third of the country that is 100% behind Trump,
Right.
um, but most of the rest of the country is not. And I
Mhm.
think a good chunk voted in 2024 because of frustrations they had with how their lives were going, and their lives have not gotten better, I think, in most respects. And if you look at recent polling, Trump is very much underwater in terms of just his general popularity. And then, specific actions like sending troops to DC is not popular, or having these sort of very aggressive police state style roundups of immigrants.
Mhm.
In on the abstract, people like the idea of lower immigration, but they don't like images of masked officials breaking car windows and dragging, separating families. Like people are genuinely disturbed by that. And so I think it is always important to remind ourselves that most people do not support most of the Trump agenda.
Right. Yeah, I think you make such a good point that it is really difficult for people to, come to grips with, cracks in the worldview. It's just it's human nature to keep doubling down into looking for any evidence that, supports your premise. Is there anything that we can do, in terms of, talking with people, to try and be more persuasive, or, because I think for those of us who have been very disturbed by the path of this country under Trump for, almost a decade, um, there's a lot of frustration with people who supported him, whether it's, flipping their vote and voting for him in 2024, being a diehard supporter. We've seen Trump for who he is, and it's hard sometimes not to say, I told you so. But that's not a great, persuasive technique. So what what are the ways to try and break through?
I think in some ways this is like a better question for a psychologist, right? Like, when do people change their minds? Like, when do they?
Sure.
And we've all in our lives, we've all had those moments where we realize, oh, I completely messed up here. I made a big mistake.
Right.
I think you have to have compelling evidence. And I think you also need to have some room to admit you were wrong. And this is why I think when you see people who voted for Trump say, this is not what I signed up for, it
Mm.
is very easy to say, well, but he was very upfront about a lot of these policies. When they held up signs saying mass deportation now at the Republican convention, that was not a coded message. They were
Right.
saying what they wanted to do. So it shouldn't be a surprise. But I do think it's important to give people who are maybe not paying a ton of attention to politics, who maybe vote more based on vibes than on detailed looks at policy agendas, to give them room to say, okay, I think this what's happening now is bad. And um, now there is a ton of debate within progressive circles about what is the right tone and what are the right words.
Right.
I'm not gonna weigh into that, but I think, some of this is just gonna swing back because presidents become less popular over time in general, but I think we also need to find a way to make politics more fun and engaging for them.
Mm.
One thing I was watching. I don't know if you saw this, but I was watching, Mamdani, the mayoral candidate in New York.
Yeah.
I don't agree with a lot of his policies, I'll say that, but I think he's a fantastic politician in the current context. And one of the things he did this past weekend is he organized a scavenger hunt where people used public transportation, and the clues were about former mayors of New York. And it got like thousands of people out onto the street of New York,
Mhm.
and it looked like tremendous fun, right? It looked like,
Yeah.
this would be a great way to spend a day. You're talking to other people who are interested in the same issues.
Mm.
And one of the things that Trump and his rallies did was to create a sense of community for people
Right.
and to invite a sense of participation in politics. Some of those participatory activities were terrible, right? They were
Yes.
inviting people to join QAnon or to engage
Right.
in conspiracy theories, like very destructive. But it still gave people sort of a role to engage in, that they weren't just passive receivers of
Yeah.
information. And
Right.
I do think for progressives, community building where they actually respect um, the people they're trying to talk to enough that they're doing more than just sending texts asking for money, that they're engaging them in some meaningful ways, has to be one pathway to re-engaging the public. Because I think
Right.
the only group that are less popular than Trump right now are probably Democratic leaders.
Right. Absolutely. And I mean, we did lose a big sense of community during the pandemic. We were all very isolated, and that's had an impact in so many ways. And so, I think you make a great point that Trump was good at bringing people together in kind of a negative sense, and, an us against them mentality. But, bringing people together in a positive sense is really important. And I think is something that's been lost with, us being much more online and, things like the pandemic. And I think that's definitely something for us to think of. And so, I think that's a good place for us to stop. I know we could probably talk for hours about what Trump has been doing in every department. And we'll continue to rely on you and your excellent articles for some of that in-depth analysis. I know that Trump is certainly going to be giving us much more to talk about in other departments as he kind of consolidates power. But thank you so much for being here, Don. Your insights are invaluable, and I so appreciate the articles that you share with us at Lincoln Square.
My pleasure, and I hope everyone has a fantastic day.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.